Well, good morning and happy Mother's Day again. Really good to see you today. Glad you're here. If you got a Bible, meet me in Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6 is where we're going to be today. If you're just hopping in with us this morning, we're working our way through the Gospel of Mark together. And if you're not a church person or a Bible person at all, we've actually got 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus in the New Testament. 2 that are written directly as eyewitness accounts. One that was written by a historian who collected all of the eyewitness accounts and compiled them together. And then one called Mark, who is actually written by a close friend of Peter's, who collected Peter's stories and wrote them down. And each of these accounts tell the story of Jesus from a different angle. Matthew talks about Jesus as the king. John talks about Jesus as God and Savior. Luke talks about Jesus as a real human who relates to real people. And Mark answers the question that all of us have who have read the other books. What in the world happened to Peter? This fisherman with a foot-shaped mouth who constantly shows up wearing certainty that's an ill-fitting mask over a man who is scared to death most of the time, but becomes a humble, bold, courageous man that God used to change the world for the better. And not just him, 10 other guys who have virtually nothing in common with each other, but a whole lot in common with us. Some of them, at the very beginning, they wanted absolutely nothing to do with Jesus, but discovered along the way that they didn't want to live life without him. Others who literally grew up around Jesus and then discovered that they were so familiar with him that they'd completely missed who he is. All of them find themselves radically transformed in all of the best ways after their lives intersected with Jesus. So we're spending most of this year just slowing down, looking at what happened to them to discover if maybe something like that might happen for people like us, whatever our starting point is with Jesus, even on a day like today. If you were here last week, we started into a story that's actually pretty familiar. Jesus takes a little kid's Lunchable and multiplies it in the hands of disciples to feed 5,000 hungry men, not even counting their wives and their children, maybe as many as 20,000 people. And I'm not going to re-preach that message for you today, but what most of us that were here last week have been trying to live into, hopefully experimenting with this week, is trying to lean into some impossible moments in our lives rather than leaning away from them. To begin organizing our lives as if the impossible is possible even before there's any evidence that it is. To live with this consistent posture that says, I can't, Jesus can. I think I'll let him. And I hope you had a chance to step into that this past week. And if you didn't, that you'll get a chance to this week. But here's the question I have for you this morning, even as we think about that. What if it doesn't work? What if it doesn't work? What if you put all that you have in Jesus' hands, and in the face of an impossible situation or a need or a circumstance that you start living towards something that you're pretty convinced Jesus could do even before it's clear what he will do. And you begin to lean into an impossible situation and organize your life around possible, and nothing happens. Or worse, things don't get better. They get worse. They get harder. You lean into an impossible conversation. It feels like it all blows up in your face. You step into something that you feel like God is leading you into, and there isn't a breakthrough at all. In fact, it feels like things end up worse than they were before. All you're trying to do is be obedient, but it feels like you're not making any progress. You're trying really hard. You're doing everything you know how to do. And life gets harder. Things get more complicated than they were before. And the worst part, if you've lived there or perhaps are even living there today, isn't necessarily just the circumstance or the impossible problem. The worst part is Jesus feels further away than ever. Anyone? That's exactly where the disciples find themselves in the story that we're looking at today. It's another familiar story that actually, despite how you've heard it before, is not a separate story from the story that we started into last week. Mark wants to make sure we don't miss that. Look at Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 45. 5,000 are fed. Disciples gather up 12 baskets full of leftovers, one for each of them. And then look at verse 45. Immediately, So no costume change, no scene change, no intermission, no to be continued. Just immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on the mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake. He was alone on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly after dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately, he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. So something that feels trivial, but it isn't. If you're familiar with the story, isn't it interesting? Mark's telling us this story from whose vantage point? Remember what we said? Whose vantage point? Peter's. Okay, do you know this story? There's a significant piece of this story that the two eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, tell, but that Peter leaves out. What's that part of the story? Yeah, Peter doesn't tell us anything about Peter walking on the water. That's nuts, right? Like, that's the only part of the story I'd tell if I was Peter. Unless Peter doesn't want you to miss the point that Peter missed all along the way. The story's not about Peter. It's not just about being the one guy who's willing to get out of the boat, has the courage to do something cool with Jesus while everybody else sits scared in the middle of the boat. When Peter tells the story, he wants to make sure that you learn an even deeper, harder lesson than that one. Notice how the story begins. It's sometime late in the evening, just after dinner time. Everybody's full of bread and fish. And Mark tells us, verse 45, immediately, notice these two words, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat, go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And the word made is the real word there. Okay, it's not Jesus invited or Jesus gave permission for them to get in the boat if they didn't want to stick around and do the dishes, just this once. In fact, you could translate that word made compelled or forced or pressed. Okay, so moms, you know the difference. Like, this isn't just, hey, kids, we should probably start loading up soon so we can get you to school on time. This is the word for, hey, get in the car, we're going. So don't miss that. Jesus tells them, get in the boat. Go to Bethsaida. Okay, so not a trick question. Jesus makes them get in the boat and tells them to go to Bethsaida. Okay, not a trick question. What does it look like for these guys to obey Jesus in this moment? Not a lot of gray area in this, is there? Not a lot of wiggle room. Obedience to Jesus looks like get in the boat, go to Bethsaida. Yes? So what do? They get in the boat and go towards Bethsaida. All they've done at this point is exactly what Jesus told them to do. Do you see that? And meanwhile, Mark says, after leaving them, Jesus goes up on the mountainside to pray. Okay, so guys on the boat being obedient, Jesus leaves them to it. Jesus leaves them in it and goes to pray. Just in case you missed it, Mark goes on, verse 47, later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake and he was alone on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. All right, so why are the disciples straining at the oars? Well, one reason's obvious. Mark gives it to us. Because the wind was against them. What's the other reason they're straining at the oars in the middle of the storm? Because Jesus told them to get in the boat and go to Bethsaida, and they're determined to obey him. Okay, that's the only explanation, isn't it? I mean, so some of these guys were fishermen. This is not their first rodeo. They've been on the lake before. They've been in high winds before. Storms aren't uncommon on the Sea of Galilee, even surprise storms. And what's the logical thing to do if you find yourself against the wind in a surprise storm on the Sea of Galilee? Even if you're 4 miles out on an 8-mile journey, just pick up the oars, let the wind carry you to shore, wait the storm out, and try again when it's over, right? That's logical. Now, these guys are knuckleheads, but they're not complete morons. So why are they trying to outmuscle the wind the whole night? Well, remember, Jesus sent them out right after dinner. Okay, this moment, we're told in one of the other eyewitness accounts, takes place in the 4th watch of the night. So someplace between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning. Okay, I mean, this is impressive what these guys have done all night. I don't know if you've ever been on a rowing machine. Like, I'm in decent shape. I'm good for about 20 minutes on that thing tops. They're straining against the oars for conservatively 5 or 6 hours. And why? Because dadgummit, Jesus sent them and they're determined to obey him. They're not going to drift. They're not going to quit. They're doing everything they know how to do what Jesus told them to do, to go where Jesus told them to go. Okay, don't miss this. Sometimes following Jesus doesn't feel like breakthrough. Sometimes obedience to Jesus feels like you're rowing into the wind, doing what he said to do for a really long time, even when it doesn't appear to be working. And the mistake we make in moments like this one, we assume if it's this hard, we must have missed him along the way. If it's this hard, we must be doing something wrong. But what if the reason that it's this hard is that we obeyed him right into the hard? Here's what Mark wants you to see. Following Jesus doesn't always feel like progress. Sometimes Jesus sends us into situations where we're doing exactly what he told us to do, and we feel like we're going nowhere in a hurry. That's this story. You keep blessing your neighbor. They keep keeping their distance. You keep showing up for that relationship, and it just keeps not getting any better. I mean, moms, our friend Shalene Roberts just released a book. The whole title of the book is When Mothering is Hard and Nobody Sees. Some of you know exactly what that feels like. You're straining. You're rowing. You're giving it everything you got. Everything you know how to do to be the mom that God's called you to be. And gosh, it just feels like nothing's happening. And nobody sees. That's these guys. And worse, while you're doing everything he told you to do, Jesus seems to be nowhere to be found. Are you tracking in the story? And that might be the hardest part of the whole thing, right? Not just that it's hard, not just that you're tired, not just that it feels like it's not working, that Jesus feels absent in the middle of all of it. If you've been there and you're honest with yourself, there's the moment, isn't there, where you start wondering, did he just leave me out here? In fact, some of you that don't follow Jesus, this is why you don't follow Jesus, isn't it? He actually tried following Jesus one time, but it didn't go like you expected it would, or that you thought like it should. Your prayers felt like they just bounced right back off the ceiling at a really critical time. You weren't immediately healed or fixed. The problem wasn't immediately solved. You felt like you were straining against the oars and finally just decided that Jesus wasn't in it at all. The options for you felt like either this thing isn't real or he left me out here alone. And neither of those felt like good options. And I don't blame you. Peter wouldn't blame you if those were the only two options. But Peter sees one more possibility here that might be worth considering. Look back at verse 48. Mark says, he saw the disciples straining at the oars. Okay, don't miss that. They couldn't see him, but he didn't miss them. They're right there in the middle of the lake, in the dark, fighting the wind, exhausted, not making progress, falling further and further behind. And the whole entire time, Jesus has not taken his eyes off of them. So I remember with all three of our kids, trying to teach them how to go to sleep on their own, in their own bed at night. So some of you have had this experience. I remember they're struggling, they're crying in the crib. Carrie is struggling and crying on the porch. And the whole time, their father was sitting just on the other side of their door with his eyes glued to that video monitor, ready to spring into action the moment that they actually needed me. They felt like nobody was there, nobody was watching. Their father was watching the whole time, ready to spring into action in the moment that they needed me. Now, notice, not the moment that they felt like they needed me. Notice in this story, just because Jesus feels distant doesn't mean that he is absent. And yet, don't stop there. If you just stop with, he sees you, it might be a little bit comforting, but it's totally incomplete. That's not enough. The passage keeps going. Jesus doesn't just see them from a distance. Mark says in the second half of verse 48, shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. Okay, so think about that. He doesn't just shout instructions at them from the shore. He doesn't just observe from afar. He comes to them through the storm. And yet, do you notice the tension inside the tension? Like Jesus comes walking to them on the storm, and the guys see him coming. And they don't shout, oh, sweet, Jesus is here, we're good. Jesus shows up in the storm, and what happens? They don't recognize that it's him. Which is strange. They've been following him. They've been watching him. They've been listening to him, learning from him, obeying him. But when he shows up in the middle of the storm, they miss him. And worse, they think he's a ghost, which tells you something, doesn't it? Sometimes Jesus shows up in the middle of your situation, but not like you expected him to show up. Here's what's really wild. He's not just near them. He's not just coming to them. Do you see in the story? He's coming to them on the very thing that's been holding them back. The wind that's exhausting them, the water they can't control. He's walking on it. And yet that doesn't comfort them. It totally freaks them out. Verse 49, when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. And notice, this is the first time fear enters the occasion. They're not afraid because the storm was so bad and the wind was so strong and they're not going to make it on time. They're afraid because they don't recognize the one who just showed up for them. Jesus is moving towards them in the moment. They don't recognize who he is. That's the real problem on the boat that night. It's not the wind, the waves. It's that they're looking right at Jesus and they don't see clearly who he is. That's when Jesus speaks. Not to the wind, not to the waves. He speaks to them in the middle of the storm. Immediately, verse 50, he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." All right, this is so important. Do you notice what Jesus does first? Before he does anything about the storm around them, Jesus speaks to the storm inside of them. And what he says is really important. He says, "Take courage. It is I." Which isn't just Jesus saying, "Hey fellas, calm down, it's me." Original language is just two words. Jesus says, "Take courage. I am." The same exact words that God spoke to Moses out of a burning bush, which says, "I am who I promised I would be. I am exactly who you need me to be in this moment, regardless of whether you feel it or not. I am." So don't miss what's happening. in this story. The one who commands the storm is walking towards them on top of it. The thing that's overwhelming them is underneath his feet. And there has never been a moment that it wasn't. Look at verse 51. Mark says, then, finally, he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. But that's not the end of the story. You just stop there, you miss the point. Think that it's a story about patience and courage and endurance, right? Just saddle up, gut it out. After a really long time, God will show up and make your storm go away. That's not where Mark wants the story to hit. Look at the second half of the verse. They were completely amazed. Why? Because they hadn't understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. That make you say, wait, what? And what do loaves have to do with the storm and the walking on the water? Well, they thought the miracle the night before was about bread and providing for impossible needs. But it wasn't just about that. It was about revealing who Jesus is when you don't have enough. Because they missed that. They missed him again in the storm. So what if obedience doesn't work? What if you follow Jesus and it feels like it gets harder? What if you're rowing and straining, obeying, and it feels like you're staying right where you are, making no progress, and Jesus feels far away? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's not there. It doesn't mean that you missed him. It might just mean that he's about to show you something about himself that you wouldn't and couldn't learn any other way. They saw the lesson on the shore, but it bounced right off of their hard hearts. We learn things about Jesus' nearness and power and goodness during storms that we just won't ever learn when it's calm. So the question is, are you remembering what he's already shown you? Or are you sitting in a boat loaded down with 12 basketful of evidence all around you and still assuming that what he's calling you to is entirely up to you? See, following Jesus is not a promise that all of life's storms go away. Sometimes they don't. It isn't a promise that every act of obedience will pay off immediately if you just get your faith muscle right. Following Jesus is a promise that you're never in it alone, that you're never unseen, and that the one who sent you into it will show up for you in it and reveal who he is to you in ways that you could never see otherwise. So one of the hard and holy things about my job as a pastor is that I'm often invited into the hardest moments that people face. As people walk through loss or grief or a diagnosis or a broken relationship or just a season that doesn't seem to make any sense. And not always, but enough that I'm not surprised anymore when it happens. On the other side of it, and sometimes right in the middle of a moment like that, what I hear people say is some version of, I hate everything about this. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. I wouldn't ever choose this for myself again. And I would not trade what I've discovered about God in the middle of this for all of the money in the world. That's what this story is showing us. The storm wasn't the point. Neither was the bread or the fish. Looking for and seeing Jesus clearly is the whole thing. And when you do, sometimes he shows you a way around the storm. But sometimes he shows us the way to walk through the storm. Or even sometimes how to walk over the storm. Not to say it's easy or simple or always fun, especially in the moment, but the spiritual journey is so often about going from seeing God sometimes in the places that we expect to find him to seeing him everywhere. Especially in the places we would never have thought to look for him. And in hindsight, some of the stories that begin with exhaustion, straining against the oars, turn into the most exhilarating. Watching Jesus show up for you, walking on top of the very thing you thought was holding you back. So if you didn't get a chance this week to lean into the impossible like it's possible, give it another shot this week because of who you are and who you're following. But if it doesn't appear to work, if it feels like it's taking you nowhere or backward, take heart and look closely because Jesus might be closer than you think and showing you more than you ever would have seen any other way. Would you pray with me? Lord, I want to pray this morning specifically for the person who's walking through a storm. Maybe it feels like a storm. Maybe it just feels like the wind's against them. They just can't catch a break. And all they've tried to do is to follow you and be faithful to you and to do exactly what you've invited them to do. And it just seems like nothing's working out. Jesus, would you reveal who you are to them in a way that they can see it and can't miss it? For the hearts that have grown hard, Lord, I pray that you would soften them and show who you are, what you're like. And for the person, Lord, who showed up today, who's hit the unfollow button on Jesus because of the presence of storms in their life or because what they felt like would happen immediately hasn't even happened progressively yet. That today would be a day where they realize that Jesus sees them and is for them to the point that he came to the earth and in an ultimate sense walked on top of everything that held us back and threatened our life. Walked on top of brokenness and sinfulness, who gave us a perfect example and who paid the perfect price when he died on a cross and rose from the dead to offer us forgiveness and freedom and life forever. And he offered it as a gift. Lord, for the person that's never received that gift, I pray at this moment, right where they sit, they would receive that gift and simply tell you they've trusted themselves for a long time. But in this moment, they're putting the weight of their trust in Jesus as Savior. And would you let us all, Lord, be people who follow you into the face of impossible things, even when it feels like it's not working. Because we know that you're the one that makes the way, even on top of the things that have held us back. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.